Hello, everybody. I'm Pete LaBarbera, President of Americans for Truth about homosexuality, and this is Americans for Truth Live. We are a pro-family group fighting the LGBT queer movement, and we are on our last day with our guest, Lori Higgett. This is day 4. Lori is a writer with Illinois Family Institute, and I've also got Mike Heath from Helping Hands Ministry on the line. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Pete.
Today we're going to be talking again about transgenders and the transgender agenda, and also just I wanted to say get Lori's reaction to the idea that we're dealing in this is a movement which creates its own reality, and this is the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which is the modern in-your-face gay activist movement. And Lori, to a degree, I think there's so many parallels because homosexual activists also created their own reality. They created the idea that they are a subspecies of humanity who live by a different set of sexual rules, as it were. And it grew from that, and then it grew to redefining marriage. But all of these movements are based in there's an artificialness about it. It's an ideology, and while it is very easy these days, still, thankfully, to expose transgender ideology, it's becoming very difficult to write critically and expose gay ideology. And the reason we've talked about that in our interviews with Lori is that there seems to be an accommodation coming among conservatives. Conservatives are sort of bugging out of the what used to be called the gay agenda, and I think it's a very bad development because this is really this has been a mainstay of the conservative political movement for a long time. But you see many libertarian conservatives now wanting to say, look, okay, forget about gay marriage, that issue's over, and sort of saying let's move on. And I want to get your reaction to that.
You always do this. You ask questions that have
why?
half a dozen
I'll ask you
big
one
ideas.
question. Why shouldn't we, as conservatives, move on from the fight against what used to be called, quite commonly, the gay agenda?
Well, I do want to, that wasn't a criticism. It was like a big question, and everything was really important in it, and I want to respond to a bunch of those. It's just the case of, we're the frogs in the proverbial boiling water again, that we lose, things start to happen on the fringes of society, and we say, we dismiss it. That's just this fringe, marginalized community. This is deviant activity. They'll never make it into the mainstream culture. And, so we dismiss, and then pretty soon we're there. And then it's so difficult to oppose it for many reasons. It's either, socially difficult or intellectually it requires too much thought. And so we just accept it, and we don't even, and then we blind ourselves, whether intentionally or not, to the destruction being wrought to individual human lives, families, the culture. And so that's the reason we should do this. The whole LGBT ideology is poisonous, and it's destroying families and lives, including those who are immersed and embrace and affirm that, which is why it's not loving to dismiss this, to say, let's just move on and not address this. It's not loving because real people are being harmed. And if you're a believer, and this is what I say many times, is to say Christians have to start acting like they believe their beliefs are true. We act like we don't believe they're really true. Like if you really think people you love, friends, colleagues, neighbors, family members, that embracing a homosexual or transgender life is threatening to their eternal life. Right. Setting aside the real life implications of what's happening to their bodies, does that not matter to you? I'm continually shocked that people are saying, oh, my friend, I just want to affirm them and make them feel good. Really? And do you really think that they're going to spend eternal life separated from God? Because clearly you don't. And so that's the reason.
Yeah, and Lori, you make a tremendous point, and I've heard many people say the same thing. Like, for example, Brian Kamaker, we were talking, he's with Mass Resistance, about, we're talking a lot about religious liberty, but I'm not really confident in people to use that liberty to make the case, the biblical case you're talking about. It's a tremendous point. It's very it's like we want religious liberty, and yet we don't really want to make the case. And my question is, do people really believe what the Bible says about homosexuality? Do people really share God's belief? If you believe that the Word of God, that the Bible is God's revelation to mankind, do we really believe that homosexuality, the behavior, is abominable? In other words, detestable?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's a question that right now has to be posed most directly to those who claim to affirm theological orthodoxy. Since so many churches have abandoned that, they're embracing heresy, it's an irrelevant question to them, right, because they've reinterpreted Scripture in order to accord with the desires of homosexuals and those who cross-sex identify. But to theologically orthodox Christians, it's a really important question. I will say that I do think that a lot of Christians in the culture don't understand the separation of church and state, what that means, and they actually are beginning to be persuaded by the people like Frank Bruni of the New York Times, who said your religious, free exercise is limited to your homes, your pews, and your hearts. I think those are the terms that he used. And we're deceived into thinking that, forgetting that, for example, in Letters from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, said a just law is one that conforms to God's law. And no one ever challenges that idea in the culture. And no one ever, if we say, if I say, marriage has a nature central to which is sexual complementarity, and without which a marriage is not a union is not a marriage, people will say, well, you can't say that, like that. You have no right to have that influence policy because that's your religious beliefs. And yet no one says that to those who would go to churches who affirm pro-gay theology. So I think we have to do some work somewhere. I think it actually has to take place in the church, help people understand what the separation of church and state really entails. I want to talk about, this is something that you went into when you were talking about how did this LGBT movement gain ground, and one of the things is, and it is pertinent to using the term sexual orientation, which I will not use without scare quotes, but that they engage in category confusion, and they always have.
Right.
They've always used the analogy that homosexuality is analogous to race, which it's not. And so you have to get people to say, well, what constitutes, because sexual orientation really only means homosexuality and bisexuality. Because if you say, oh, we can't have people discriminated against based on sexual orientation, no one ever means based on heterosexuality. Who is discriminated against based on their heterosexuality, since in any objective sense, all humans are heterosexual. In other words, that's the way we procreate. So no one is ever discriminated. So it's just a deceptive term intended to confuse people, to conflate homosexual activity and desire and heterosexuality, to make them seem like they're flip sides of the same coin, when in reality they're not. And it's based on, instead, the left engages in this category confusion, saying, oh, homosexuality.
And there's so many. There's so many categories. You're saying it boils down to homosexuality, heterosexuality, and bisexuality, but I mean, you've got pansexuality, and we could easily go back. Everybody, I think the guy's name was Andy Humm. He was a New York activist. This is probably 2 decades ago, when I think Andy Humm, I think that's his name, wrote that pedophilia is an orientation. So you've seen pedophilia described. This would be sex between, or sexual attraction. Well, actually, Lori, the Before You Act website, and let me pull that up, Jared. B for the number 4, the letter U, act, ACT. BeforeYouAct.org. They're now talking about pedophiles. That's the letter B, the number 4, the letter U, ACT. They're redefining pedophiles, Lori, I know you know this, as minor attracted persons. So I suppose
right.
That's also an orientation now.
Well, right. And also they do that with incest. It's genetic sexual attraction, GSA. And so, but I just wanted to say one thing about what I'm talking about, category confusion with regard to race. And this is where I think we need to I mean, we can still push to have the term sexual orientation removed. If they want to put homosexuality in there, go ahead and try. But we have to understand that race and let's say a biological sex are constituted by objective, immutable conditions that have nothing to do with behavior, nothing to do with volitional behavior. And whereas whether you want to say genetic sexual attraction or homosexuality, those are, even by leftists like SIECUS, the Sexuality, Information Education Council of the United States, liberal organization, they define sexual orientation, but it's really just homosexuality, as your subjective feelings, your behaviors, and erotic fantasies. They include that. How is a condition constituted by those features analogous to race or biological sex? It's not. And that's why, so if we're going to leave sexual orientation in there, then we have to say what other conditions similarly constituted by sexual feelings, volitional sexual acts, and if you want to include the leftist idea, erotic fantasies, are we going to include in there? Are we going to include infantilism and sadomasochism, polyamory? Those are the ones that are analogous. And so they made such headway on what is called category confusion. And I think I'm not going to stop trying to expose it. You're not going to. So we just have to make people understand it.
Right. And before we leave that site, Before You Act, it's very interesting that they're at the study stage. If you go back, homosexuality was first studied before it was sort of advanced, before people started advancing tolerance. And of course, that grew. And now we're at the point where this group is saying, if I remember correctly, this Before You Act, we have to treat, we have to watch the stigma. They're starting to talk about, we don't want to stigma MAPS, minor attracted persons. And so they're basically following in the same footsteps as the gay activists. And that gay strategy that came out, it was actually before Stonewall, and it was, but Stonewall was the catalyst for the sort of in your face, when they would start what we see today. That has been mimicked, and everybody's using it now, Lori, including not even sexual things. Aren't the Muslims? They've borrowed, the radical Islamic activists have borrowed from the gay strategy. A lot of groups now, I think the pagans are doing, pagan pride. A lot of other groups, maybe at the fringes of what used to be the fringes of American society, have recognized that this political strategy that the homosexual activists used worked.
Yeah, it works. And that's why it's very difficult to argue if you apply their principles consistently. It's very hard to argue against genetic sexual attraction. And we're seeing more of that because
incest, in other words.
It's incest, right. And where you're seeing it in the culture is either siblings who were separated at birth, that they've got all these, or that they are the product of, some kind of aid to having children, sperm donations, egg donations, and they reconnect for the first time as adults, and sometimes it's mother and child too, or father and child, and you'll see that. And when you say love is love, when that's their motto, how do you argue against that? And particularly, like they'll say, oh, well, they might have defective babies. Well, we live in an abortion culture. That's not an issue. And what would it be if it was like a father and a son or two brothers who are attracted to each other? What's the argument against that? And actually, when I make this argument, increasingly I'm seeing people, and it's very disturbing, say, yeah, there is nothing wrong with that. Like, who am I? They're saying, who am I to judge? Because when you remove any kind of outside objective source of morality, and you're left with just humans, then of course what's wrong with two brothers being in love and expressing it sexually? Right. They can't procreate. And of course with minor attracted persons, right now all we're left with as an argument is consent. And that's why people are saying, well, children can't give consent. Well, what age can't they give consent? Or what age can they give consent? And that will start to lower. Right. And that's where inevitably it will.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Lori, let's skip over to Lori is out of Facebook jail. And we talked about that yesterday. Jared, pull up. I wanted to show you, because this is exactly on the topic Lori writes about most. The reason I was put in Facebook jail for 30 days last time was because here, and it's on the screen there, Linda Harvey was speaking. I believe it was the 2016 AFTA banquet, and we put in we advertised for her event, and I put a picture of a girl, a young, I think 20-something, very sad story there. It's on the screen. This is Alex and Matheny, and this is a picture of her. And I said the caption is "From beautiful girl to pretend transgender man." Look at that. This is a young woman. Look how beautiful she is on the left. This is her now. She wants to be a man. She had her healthy breasts surgically removed. And because of that photo being, and this was 2 years ago, I think, Jared and Mike, I got the notice like just a couple months ago from something 2 years ago. It's so Orwellian, Lori. People are actually being taken off Facebook or whatever the platform is for these. Somebody's going back and finding old posts, which are certainly not hateful. This is, if anything, we're saying that we're calling this woman what she is. She's a beautiful woman, but she's embraced this lie. And now look what she's done to herself. And you talked about real world consequences, Lori. What could be more real world than physically destroying your healthy body in pursuit of this fantasy?
It is, and it's a fantasy. I mean, you're all, whatever your sex is can never change. It's immutable. And so that's the point. What they're really banning is the expression of ideas that they don't like, because it's not negative, it's not critical, it's not bullying, it's not offensive. It's in any conventional understanding of those terms, of course, as they redefine. I mean, everything is dependent on their redefinitions. Bullying is now redefined. I mean, the term, as you pointed out the other day, homophobia, that means, an irrational fear or hatred of homosexuals, and that's not what and they know it, that's not what the experience, which is why I brought up that there's this movement to change the word to transmisia, because they know that people like us don't hate or express violence toward people like this. So, yeah, and that's why, when we talk about, in which was my banning, I used the word tranny or trannies, plural. That's the sole reason I was banned.
Right.
And I'm saying if we don't stop now capitulating to their language diktats, they're just going to increase what we can or cannot say.
Can I ask you, as a mom, Lori, when you look at this woman here, and this is so sad, and this is one of those girls, and you talked about, Lori, how there's this whole transgender movement. They say, oh, look, here's my surgery, and they show it off. This is one of the people who did that. She was very angry at me for publishing this, but this came from Twitter. Everybody, can you what would you, as a mom, let's just say, and your daughter came home and she said she feels more like masculine than feminine. What would you tell her if she was contemplating something like this?
Well, I mean, I would say a lot, and one thing that's very helpful, if people out there have children, and now because of this rapid onset gender dysphoria, a lot of people are experiencing this with their adolescent or college-age daughters. Go to Fourth Wave now and read some of the material. It's not a conservative website. It's just a website started by parents who are concerned about the culture really pushing kids who experience some discomfort either about their bodies or their sense of themselves as male or female. I would talk to them about, I would try to get at the root of when the feeling started and what were they looking at, what were they thinking, what were they feeling, what kinds of experiences did they have, because there's all sorts of reasons that people experience discomfort with their bodies or discomfort with their sense of male or female. And a lot of that is just developmentally normal. But the culture is providing a distorted lens through which young people are reinterpreting normal developmental experiences, confusion about sexual identity. And there are so many reasons. We know that, for example, people who are autistic experience more gender dysphoria. It's not so that gender dysphoria is not they're not really trapped in the wrong body. It's that their autism is creating this feeling about their bodies. And so that's what I would encourage. There's a really great...
hold on, let me interrupt you there, Lori. I pulled up your article that we talked about, and I've actually mistitled it. Sorry about that. It's supposed to be, the proper title is supposed to be Surprising Stuff You Should Know About Trans Cultism, but it just came out Stuff You Should Oh, my
Right. Well, that works. I'm
that
okay.
word, yeah, it's stuff. It's weird stuff, but the whole topic is weird.
Well, but I don't want people to think it's not weird stuff. A lot of this is helpful stuff to
This is
those.
helpful information that most people are going to hear, and I want to explain the
Right.
photo. This is a photo I took when I was. This is, I think, 2007 Chicago Gay Pride Parade, which is this massive gay pride parade. I was shocked the first time I went, and there was a man. This is a pretend woman, flashing his fake breasts all along the pride parade. Now, this is the route. Especially now, perhaps more than 2007, but I'm sure back then as well, lots of children, young children, attend these LGBT so-called pride parades. And so you have this kind of behavior, and this guy was, getting his jollies, flashing his fake breasts all along the route. But Lori, I want you to address that, the children what they're being exposed to, and what you thought was the most important things of the surprising things about trans cultism, as you call it, from the piece.
Okay, well, about children being exposed to any of this stuff, parents just have to work hard not to do that. And we know now there's three young boys who are deeply involved in the drag queen world. Lactatia, Desmond is amazing, and there's a third one, I've forgotten his name, and I just came across him this year. I mean, just like last week. And all three of them came to be interested in this phenomenon from their mothers watching RuPaul's Drag Race with them at very young ages, 5, 6 years old. They wouldn't even, and they shouldn't know anything about this deviant world. And so parents have to do everything they can to protect their children because they're vulnerable. I mean, the story that happened last year in California, where in the kindergarten teacher or first grade teacher, I forget, I think it was first grade, got into a lot of trouble because they had a student that was a little boy identifying as a girl. At these young ages, it's primarily little boys. And so she had him go into a bathroom and come out dressed in girls' clothing and introduce them to the classmates and said, he's now a girl. No notification to parents. And so the way one mother found out was her daughter was taking a bath that night and saw herself reflected with her hair slicked back from the bath in the chrome, and started crying and told her mother that she was afraid she was turning into a boy. So this is how malleable children's imaginations are and their thought process, and how confusing this is to tell children that some people that are as what the left will say is identified as boys or assigned boys at birth. They're not assigned boys or girls. They're identified as what they are. And this is the problem this is why it should not go on in schools. And then I forget the second part. Oh, the most important. I can't even pick that out because there's so much important stuff in there and these are not, my ideas. The article is filled with citations from other people. A lot of people don't know about detransitioning. That is, people who have been identifying as the opposite sex and change their mind, and if they've had surgery and chemical interventions, they can't undo all those effects, and they deeply regret. There was one BBC documentary, I'm sure I have it in there somewhere in the article, very painful. I mean, she's, kept in shadows, but very painful story of a young woman, and she understands now why she was confused and thought she was a male, and she's had a double mastectomy, and her voice has changed. And it's very painful to watch these stories about.
Lori, that article talks about the false suicide or the reality of suicide. Because let's back up. I mentioned this the other day. What's happening is these parents, their kids are saying sometimes, look, if you don't let me transition, I may commit suicide. So talk about that and what the reality is of the science on that.
Well, yeah, they should go to this article online because I'm really quoting J. Michael Bailey and Blanchard. They're them talking about how the Williams Institute study in which the suicide is mentioned, in which it's been misinterpreted and misquoted, talked about how the actual suicide risk of children who experience gender dysphoria is very, very low, and there's no evidence that surgery will reduce that incidence. And in fact, if you actually go to the Williams Institute, which it's a leftist thing, so they don't like when the opposition is using their study honestly. They even say they don't know what's cause and effect there. And Bailey and Blanchard make clear that they don't know if gender dysphoria is the cause of the suicidal ideation.
But parents, you can't blame them. They're freaking out. Their
Right.
kids are so. I mean, but they have to understand. I mean, we saw that girl. Do you want your daughter to harm herself? Do you want your son to take these hormones? I mean, this is physically destructive behavior that this ideology is associated with, and so. I mean, they need to learn that information.
Right. Because parents are being terrified into believing that if they don't affirm and embrace this ideology and all of its logical outworkings, chemical and surgical, that their child will commit suicide, and that is not true. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to find counselors who will be able legally to help sort through why there are these experiences of gender dysphoria. And we know that this is not there is literally no evidence that girls can be born with boys' brains or boys can be born with girls' brains. There's literally no evidence of that. There is some evidence that maybe that there can be some, hormonal imbalances that might create feelings, but that doesn't mean, therefore, that you go okay, we didn't get to talk about this, but I want to say it really briefly. There's a condition called body integrity identity disorder, where people experience a persistent, powerful mismatch between their internal sense of themselves and their physical embodiment. It doesn't have to do with sex. It has to do usually with limbs. They identify as amputees, and they want to have, usually it's like the bottom half of one leg removed to make their internal sense of themselves and their bodies match. We don't, at least now, we don't currently do that. Now, some actually experience a desire to be paralyzed, some to be blinded, but generally the informal term is amputee wannabe. It's almost identical. What the left will say is, oh, well, that's defined in the medical community as, and they have a term for it.
Yeah.
But if you look at the actual symptoms, they're identical.
Right. Well, the same thing with a woman, a thin girl looking in the mirror and thinking she's fat. We don't accommodate that. We treat that. And Lori, we're run out of time. I want to say thank you very much for being with us for all these 4 days, and thank you for your work. You can see all Lori's articles at illinoisfamily.org. You can also see her the piece we're talking about here at americansfortruth.org. Thank you, Lori, and keep it up.
And thank you, and thanks for all your kind words on all these 4 days.
Absolutely. Okay, Mike, take us out. Mike, are you there? I don't think Mike is there.
I'm here. I'm still learning how to use this thing, believe it or not. So we got our first Pete caller today. Called in, listening on the inside. People who are listening or watching need to know that not only can you passively listen to the show, but you can become a participant. And if you want to do that, just go to the website and let us know, and we'll put you on an email list, and you'll be notified, and you'll get what you need to join the show. Someone did it for the first time today, so congratulations, Pete. Go to americansfortruth.com. Donate on the right. Donate link is on the right. Click on that link and let us know you support the show by helping us pay for it. We can't do the show without donations. We don't have any big grants. The government certainly isn't going to support this. So help us out by praying for us and making a donation today.
Yeah, and sign up for our newsletter as well at the side of the website there, and we're going to be updating the website as well. And folks, just have a great weekend, but remember that it is your duty to defend truth because it's God's truth, not ours. We'll see you Monday at noon Central Time. Thank you.